Hello and welcome to History Respawned, where we talk about history and video games, how video games adapt, interpret, and shape historical themes, settings, and ideas. We have a whole backlog of videos on our site, interviews with historians and other academics, on games from Cyberpunk 2077 to Red Dead Redemption 2, so please do consider giving those a look, and as always, it'd be great if you like the video and subscribe. I'm John Harney, and today I want to talk about Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, a game developed by Machinegames and released in 2024.
Very historical.
Myth or history? Just different ways of interpreting the past.
The game follows the adventures of the fictional character Indiana Jones in a manner that is very intentionally and pretty successfully emulating the classic kind of early films in particular of that franchise of the 1980s, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and The Last Crusade. This is helped by their use of Harrison Ford's visual likeness and incredible voice acting, particularly by Nolan North, who does a kind of an amazing version of a young Harrison Ford. And it sounds both accurate, but not derivative somehow. It's kind of incredible. Today I want to talk about the game in a couple of different ways. I want to talk about kind of how it fits itself into that idea of kind of historical memory of this media, the historical memory of these films. I'll talk about that kind of briefly. And then I'll talk in a bit more depth about how the game depicts Nazis, which I think, well, for me at least, is the most interesting historical aspect of this game. And I think the way that they depict Nazis is broadly very successful, and it is consistent with what the films do, but it's also consistent with other works by Machinegames. So first, how did the games interact with existing media? I mean, this game is in many ways shamelessly directed at millennials, people my age, or anybody, I suppose, really, who grew up with the experience of watching these movies. My own experience of Indiana Jones and Star Wars is that at least when I was a boy, it felt like they were always on at Christmas time, and I'd usually watch one of them at Christmas time, and in the years since, I will pull them out and rewatch them. In a recent class, I had my students watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and it holds up very, very well. And I was delighted at how much the students liked it. So what is Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones character all about, especially in those first three films? He is, he's handsome, he's daring, he's adventurous, and he says it belongs in a museum. And so he's there to collect, artifacts of human civilization and so on for the benefit of mankind, not to allow it to be destroyed by the enemies of mankind, which particularly in Raiders of the Lost Ark and in The Last Crusade and in this game is presented as the Nazis. So, as kind of a work of nostalgia, as a deliberate attempt to evoke a positive response from people who like those early games, this game, I think, is ridiculously successful. It also is very good, I think, at very gently moving the pieces just that little bit. So Indiana Jones still thinks that things should be in museums, but there's a subtle kind of pushback against the idea that everything gets to go into a museum in London, for example, which was both kind of imperial historical reality and kind of a subtext of the original films, whether they were there or not. In many ways, this character is very faithful to that early Indiana Jones. He has a female companion with whom he has this really interesting relationship that isn't necessarily the guy is right, the guy isn't always right. Actually, it's kind of echoes of Karen Allen in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the game just looks and feels right in that regard. So, and I can say as someone who struggled a little bit kind of in the mid part of the game, just partly because life was dragging me to other games and things like that, I persevered with it, and the game ends on this really kind of a strong note. So it's really kind of interesting in that regard, because we talk a lot about video games and movies, and there used to be this, kind of boring conversation, in my opinion, about our video games, art, and everything else. And film becomes a very obvious thing to talk about video games in relation to, because film is different from literature, obviously, from written literature, and then video games are a different thing again. So, fascinatingly, this game, I think, successfully kind of pitches in for the idea that games have this value of their own, in part by how successfully it does emulate the film. Not by trying to be those films exactly, but tapping into that same kind of energy and feeling original. I really feel like this game feels like an addition to that kind of canon of those early kind of strong Indiana Jones games. Hi, John here from a different day, because I forgot to recommend a reading, which is something I want to start doing with all these videos. So For this topic, or topics, I could have, suggested a whole bunch, but I'm going with Travelers in the Third Reich by Julia Boyd. I think it's just a really interesting kind of take on Nazism prior to the war breaking out, and kind of opinions about Nazism, or maybe a lack of opinion about Nazism from tourists specifically, but from people from the West visiting Germany in the 1920s, 1930s. It's readily available, easy to get yourself a copy. A lot of libraries have it. You might be able to get it as an ebook on your library platform. So go and do that, and then come back, and I'll talk about Nazis. Not least among this is the game's treatment of Nazis. Now, Machinegames have previous with the Nazis from their Wolfenstein reimaginings of the 2010s. Those games, I think, handle Nazis in extremely interesting ways. I show clips of those games to my students all the time in our history video games class, and we talk about what is going on here with the Nazis. And in the Wolfenstein games in particular, which are very intentionally over the top and kind of kitsch in many ways, there's a lot of joy in killing Nazis, in the Nazi punching. Reminiscent of a kind of an exploitation element that you see in the film Inglourious Basterds from Quentin Tarantino, for example. And then in the second Wolfenstein game, you see a lot. Like, there's a Black Panther character, and there's this really intentional effort to kind of push that envelope. And I think that something they do very well in those Wolfenstein games is the hatred for the Nazis is there, and the acknowledgement of a kind of the fears of what a Nazi war machine can do, but also a disdain for the Nazis. And that is something that I see in this game a lot, and I think it's done really very, very effectively. And it's something that's done very effectively in the Spielberg movies as well. Particularly, there's a great scene in Last Crusade where they kind of stumble into a book burning, and Hitler takes the notebook that everyone's looking for to try and find the Holy Grail, and ostentatiously and arrogantly signs it and hands it back. And so it's this mockery of Hitler, that at the center of his strength and his power, he has it in his hands and he gives it back, and his vanity has kind of overcome this. And this is something I see a lot of Machinegames work, and I see it in this game as well. On the one hand, the Nazis are antagonists in a very similar way they are in the films. And you see kind of different sides of the Nazis. They are fearsome, they are dangerous, they are militarily very, very powerful. The game is not a stealth game exactly, but it's quite difficult to play the game just taking people on. You are kind of encouraged to kind of go around the edges because, you're just an archaeologist, and these guys are heavily armed soldiers. But in addition to that kind of acknowledgement of the reality of the power of the Nazis, like a big old, and of fascists more generally, like a big old chunk of the early part of the game is spent in what is more or less an occupied Vatican by fascist forces. There is this, acknowledgement of the reality of the supremacy and superiority, militarily at least, and in terms of raw power in the 1930s of fascism across large swathes of Europe. But there's also that disdain. And I think that this is a very, very important thing. You see it across all kinds of media. The British have done this for decades, since the end of World War II. This desire to recognize the horrors of the Nazi engine, of the Nazi machine, of the Nazi worldview, but also to mock them for their absurdity, for the horrors of eugenicism. This idea that we can shape humanity by pruning off certain genetic kind of strands and keeping just the correct one, which of course is our one, is vile and horrid, but it's also very, very stupid. It completely contrasts with what we believe our society, civilization, if you want to use that word, is trying to do. And so I feel like in Machinegames work more broadly, and in this game, there is this moving between subtext and text that works really well. It works different in the Wolfenstein games from the Indiana Jones games, where they're doing the same thing all the time, which is kind of, we're having our cake and eating it too, which is, this is just a fun camp game, but also these guys are really evil. And I think a success of that in the game is Voss.
Vertrauen, Exzellenz, ist unabdingbar für den Sieg. Das verstehen Sie sicherlich, Pater Ventura.
So Voss is someone who has the imprimatur of Hitler. He's been sent out to kind of run this search to find the Great Circle, to find what the Nazis hope will be an ultimate weapon for them. And he's a social scientist. So he's like, you know, as often happens in stories like this, he's the inverse of our hero. So Indiana Jones is an intellectual, ultimately, who is out there trying to save knowledge from being destroyed. And this man is an intellectual who wishes to turn knowledge to the hand of his evil kind of masters. And Voss is very successful at manipulating people. The game really kind of emphasizes this. He manipulates other Nazis. He, to a certain extent, successfully manipulates Indy. And he has gained that ability rationally. He has gained the ability to manage people, to take advantage of them, to succeed, and to prevail over others through kind of the use of his rationality. But ultimately, of course, he's in service of an irrational idea, which is to eradicate the world of all but a certain chosen type of person. And as the game goes on, and I don't want to spoil anything, there are some outright gags that kind of make fun of Voss. So as much as Voss is powerful and terrifying, and he's a very, very good bad guy in the context of the game, by the time the game is over, he is... he's someone to be mocked as well. Not as obviously as another kind of important Nazi character, but to be mocked nonetheless. So where do we stand with Indiana Jones and the Great Circle from kind of an historical perspective, how historians should kind of look at it? For me personally, as someone who teaches history in the classroom and who loves bringing video games when I can, I think the game gives me lots of really kind of interesting things I can share with students, lots of really fun raw material to talk about depictions of Nazism, depictions of eugenicism, depictions of kind of the horrors of the 20th century, and so on. As I've said in this video, I think that, slightly more broadly as an historian looking at the game, I think the way that it interacts with, and kind of to a large extent, I think, successfully inserts itself into this existing filmic canon, is really interesting for kind of the history of the medium. And then more so than that, or more importantly than that, to be honest, the game is very strong in its depiction of the Nazis. It's very clever. It never loses that fun kind of an element, but it dances that line of the Nazis should be feared, the Nazis do not deserve our respect. And doing those things at the same time is very, very difficult. But I do believe the game succeeds at doing it, and that's an important thing. We're living in a time where fascism is, more attractive than I thought it was going to be. I often tell my students, I know it's difficult to understand, but, in the 1920s, certainly before the true horrors of the Holocaust came to kind of, public view in the world, fascism was looked up to and seen as a possible model. That's not as hard to sell as it used to be. But then again, as an historian, it's important to point out that in the 1920s and even into the 1930s, Nazism was a lot more popular in the United States than we would like to admit. And the global community as a whole, particularly the Western global community, although not just the Western global community, was tolerant of Nazism in ways that really was kind of horrifying only a few years later. So we're almost 100 years away now from the ascent of Hitler to the Chancellorship of Germany, and it is getting more and more difficult to keep that memory alive of just what humanity can do. I mean, of all the awful things the Nazis did, although the cost was great and too much, they did give us a lesson of what humanity can accomplish in its hatred of ourselves and in our destruction of ourselves. And it worries me that maybe that lesson is getting harder to keep in the forefront. So I'm grateful Machinegames is doing it. And I think that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a really strong example of a game that is light and fun and interesting, and it's adventurous, and you're supposed to be... It doesn't want you to leave with this kind of sense of heaviness, which is fine if you do leave games like that. But it is a very, very strong statement about Nazism and about the historicity of Nazism, the reality that it happened, and that these things can happen again, and that this kind of thinking, this ability to discard humanity in pursuit of a supposed correct goal, whether it's rational, mystical, or a combination of the two, that threat hasn't gone anywhere, probably won't go anywhere. And so I think keeping the Nazis as a cautionary tale is a really, really important thing for us to do. Thanks for watching. As I said at the very start of the video, we've got a great backlog of stuff worth checking out. You can also go and find us at historyrespawn.com. There's also our History Respawn podcast, which is on a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but there's some great conversations on there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hoping to get a few more videos out this fall. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please do like it and consider subscribing. If you're not already subscribed, it helps a lot. And I will see you next time.